Hello everyone and welcome to the latest Patient Perspectives. Today we are going to be joined by independent researcher and full-time carer Peter Coleman. So before we get in, Peter, if you can just introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit about your background as well.
Hi, my name's Peter Coleman. I'm Australian. Both my parents are British. He immigrated after the World War II. I'm currently living in Canberra and basically a full-time carer of my wife and son. My wife will be turning 70 next year. My son will be turning 36 next year. And we've been married for 37, almost 38 years. Basically, I come from middle-class family. Went through normal high school, got a Commonwealth scholarship to go to university. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. Did 4 years public service and then basically went into television and film industries. And also audio, ran my own recording studio, became a director, got into the very first 3D technology when it came out in the early mid-80s, had to learn a certain degree of coding. Everything was done in Fortran and BASIC at that stage. Started one of the first 3D companies in Canberra and then eventually moved to Sydney, where I worked with a place called Garner McLennan Design, which was one of the top 2 production houses in Sydney. Ran and produced and did the 3D department there. After quite a few years, then eventually moved to Malaysia in late 90s and helped build the industry in Malaysia. Eventually worked as company director and ran the whole department. Overall, about 45 international awards, including Clio Awards for special effects, and basically helped develop the industry. So my background is technical, it's overall science-based, but I do tend to think differently than most people, as I've been told. I have very much a very lateral way of thinking. I tend to keep a lot of things in my head and basically as new knowledge comes in, adjust that knowledge. So part of this whole journey has been how to relate multiple symptoms to multiple causes and to be able to somehow link them up and find some sort of a commonality between them in such a way that we can actually look at potential diagnosis and cures, or at least treatments.
Yeah. So you mentioned your wife and your son. They have extremely complex conditions. Would you be able to just kind of give us a little bit of more detail about what their kind of symptoms are and when they first arose and how they've progressed as well?
Okay, well, I'll start with my wife. Ultimately, a lot of these things are in common. Basically, really from puberty, she started having some physical problems in terms of loss of energy, extreme exercise, etc., made things worse, gave her a lot of pain and a lot of psychiatric problems. She was sectioned at one stage for a while and had difficulty completing tasks, partly because of fatigue. Whenever she would get stressed, she'd also get extremely fatigued. And at the same time, she was diagnosed with basically chronic depression, anxiety, etc. Went through a number of treatments, which the majority of them didn't really work, stabilized somewhat. And then when Sam was, when she was pregnant, she actually felt the best she'd ever felt in her life, even till now, which is unusual because when it came to delivery, basically after an 18-hour labour with only very little dilation, basically she had to have an emergency cesarean. What happened after that was she needed 3 days intravenous for extreme urticaria and extreme fatigue and also postpartum depression. And at the same time, then the early signs of the tachycardia that she had came on fully. So what happened then over the very first year of the birth, roughly once a month, we had to take her to hospital with a heartbeat of 240. It would just suddenly switch from 100 or something, suddenly it would go up to 220, 240, and it would stay there. And basically freaked everyone out. Initially, the standard treatment at that stage, which was isoptone, worked for a little while. After that, each one got progressively worse until finally it took roughly 6 hours to be able to stabilize it. And that was done through experimental drugs. They couldn't actually stop it. We eventually, through a number of specialists, then got onto beta blockers, and through trial and error really found one that worked, and she remains on that today. My son is common in the sense that he has slowly had similar sort of heart problems in terms of racing heart, sometimes irregular heartbeats, etc. And he is also now on beta blockers as well. So that's an underlying problem, but is under control. However, it potentially can tie into some of the potential causes. They've never actually worked out what caused it. It does appear to be whenever you get very high adrenaline rushes, which is common to both of them, basically the heart switches into a double beat to kickstart it again, and it just doesn't switch off. That electrical circuit doesn't switch. So that has remained consistent throughout. What happened then was that the fatigue and the psychiatric problems and other things, and particularly starting to get inflammation, slowly progressed from that, and also extreme pain. What was happening was that her muscles were slowly getting more and more, basically they were not actually seizures, but at the same time they were incredibly hard, very, very difficult to relax. They just simply weren't relaxing properly. And that got to the point where at certain times when she was very highly stressed, she would just literally drop to the floor, and the fatigue was so bad that she could at most open her eyes and basically move a finger to be able to indicate what was going on. So for a very, very long period of time, including the 20 years we were in Malaysia, we had a number of issues where any sort of very stressful situation would just give us such fatigue that she'd be 3 or 4 weeks absolutely solid and immobile, basically, and or hospitalized. Interestingly, the last time it happened, when she had, we were trying some different medications at that particular point, she did have a tachycardia attack, which she thumped her chest basically to try and fix it. It turned into atrial fibrillation, and 4 days in ICU still didn't resolve it. They couldn't actually stop the atrial fibrillation. In the end, she said, give me a sedative, and to the wonder of everyone, including the heart specialist, Xanax stopped it. That led the heart specialist at that time to turn around and say, look, we'll send you off. There's definitely other things wrong. And she was also tested for multiple sclerosis, a whole heap of other things from neurological issues. And basically no one could work out anything that was going on. She was progressively getting sicker. Early 50s, she started getting edema. And at one stage, literally trying to walk up the stairs, she just collapsed. Currently, that edema is so bad that her legs and feet, it's mainly restricted to. No one can work out what's causing it. It's not pitted, it's not standard fluid, it doesn't respond to diuretics, and it's so bad that she hasn't been able to wear shoes for 15 years. And they literally have got absolutely no idea currently still what is causing it. She still has the same problems with the muscles in terms of them never ever relaxing, and also never ever not being in pain. We've gone through, she's basically been on codeine, opioids, almost every type of drug. Interestingly, the certain diagnoses, when we've tried those particular pain medications, they don't work. So it's very, very specific to what sort of medication she needs, and the things that you would naturally think of as being useful for these sorts of situations simply either make it worse or at best don't work. My son was slightly different. He had problems. They were both being diagnosed with ADHD, had difficulty concentrating, and went through school, just managed to get through school. basically the stress before his last exam got so bad that he collapsed with a glucose level of 1.2. After a couple of Mentos to try and help it, went into complete hypoglycemia. Went to the doctors. He was so concerned that he could actually be awake at a 1.2 glycemic level that he actually tested him for pancreatic cancer. Both of them have got hypoglycemia if they're not constantly eating, which is also another problem, and again, which no one can currently explain, although I'm getting closer to understanding that. His main problem was that he then went at about the age of 23 to the US to study and got progressively worse. He was on Ritalin. He was given generic Ritalin because of the insurance company over there. And we found that generic Ritalin makes him worse. Whereas normal Ritalin, the branded Ritalin actually improves and gives him the opportunity to, it actually helps relax his muscles, which is again contrary to what Ritalin should do, according to the normal medical science. He was involved with a number of things which was involved with the US government, which caused him to get progressively weaker. And at the same time, he ended up with extreme PTSD, which is being diagnosed as at very extreme levels, to the top level. And what happens is his muscles were slowly getting more and more compressed and also at the same time weaker. However, he, and similar to my wife, has very high adrenaline. So what happens is with the adrenaline kicks in, he has absolute extreme strength, way beyond what a normal person would have. Ultra concentration for a period of about 40, can operate at very, very high levels for over 40 minutes without anything damaging his heart, with none of the other major organs being damaged. But at the end of it, it becomes extreme fatigue. So the things that are in common are both of them have autoimmune issues, although they are very slightly different. They both have elevated CRP. They both have elevated ESR, although my wife's normally between 40 to over 100, and it's been consistent all her life. My son's will vary. Depending on what situation he's in, it'll vary from 0 through to about 40 or 50. They also have slightly different paraprotein results. My wife has got extremely high IgM, very, very low IgA and IgG. My son's got high C4, high C5, and low IgA, I think it is. So that one varies slightly. They both of them have generalized inflammation, which includes, their face blowing up to looking quite different, particularly with my son. He'll go from a round face to a normal face, depending on how much stress there is. My wife's, it's mainly through into her gums. They both had teeth problems because of inflammation in the gums. They're currently at this stage in a situation where my son's, the muscles get locked up so much that he can't breathe. If he has a flashback, particularly from the PTSD, I have to intervene and basically try and release the energy that's built up in there. So the diagnostic journey has been almost impossible, because what has eventually now been recognised after 35 years is that they now suffer from multiple, very likely genetic conditions, all of them overlapping, all of them giving different symptoms, so that having gone to probably 5 different neurologists, about 6 different psychiatrists, metabolic specialists, physiotherapists, everyone else, they were all looking for one thing. And of course, nothing ever fitted. And that's really the reason why I ended up going, after frustration for such a long time, I've got to do something. So luckily the opportunity came up, and I thought, okay, maybe we can find this through the genes.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, like, the spectrum of kind of symptoms that they have are so broad, and what has that been like for you? Like, what have been the challenges with actually people kind of acknowledging that there is something going on that's kind of that needs to be
Well,
investigated more, and why did you then start to kind of do your own research as well?
well, I mean, look, for years and years and years and years, the difficulty is that they look well. You know, they'd come around and they would, particularly with my wife, she would only ever see people when she felt well enough to see them. No one ever saw them sick. My son hid it from himself because he thought, oh, heck, I'm getting sick like mum. He hid it from all of his friends. If he was feeling really, really bad, he simply wouldn't go out. He wouldn't participate. So most of the time it was like, how do you talk to a doctor that you've got all of these problems? They diagnose, turn around and say chronic fatigue, FMS. That's the first one, because they've got all of those literally have the same symptoms. They've got every single one of the trigger points. They've got the muscle pain. They've got that. Go to a rheumatologist. They do all the tests and go, no, it's not that. You know, it can't be anyway because she's got elevated ESR. So and chronic fatigue, as you know, is a generalised term that can be caused by so many different things. So they were labelled in many cases as malingerers because my wife couldn't do long extended work sessions. She would only be able to work for a certain amount of time. She was training to be a nurse. 3 weeks or a week before she was about to graduate, she literally collapsed and couldn't complete it. My son did 3 years university after struggling and you know, to get to that particular point. 1.5 units before the end, he called me. He said, I can't get out of bed. I had to literally fly to America to collect him. He was that ill. The doctors in America who were dealing with him were going the same thing. We don't know what it is. You know, we've gone through diagnoses from chronic fatigue, FMS. We had a metabolic specialist in Malaysia who was actually looking at MAO deficiency because of the type of results that they have with all of their catecholamines. It's generally there are such unusual clinical results. They have high GGT, but their liver is okay. And you talk to a doctor and they say, well, you should have cirrhosis of the liver, or have you been drinking? And neither of them have drunk. Like my wife stopped drinking when she was 30, hasn't had a drop since she was about 30. And yet she's got a GGT of anything up to over 200 and nothing else in the liver enzymes. The kidneys are fine. The functionality is okay, but for example, they have low B2, low B6, low B12. B12 injections did help for a little while. But again, a lot of the medications that we try will work for about 3 weeks and then they'll drop off and completely no longer work. So it's been, you know, our GPs have been the most helpful and really of any of the doctors, because you generally go to a specialist, they'll look at one particular area and say, this doesn't fit anything that I can see. I've only got 10 minutes. I don't have time to investigate this. You don't have the money to investigate this. We've gone through Stiffman's disease because at certain times my wife used to walk along and suddenly she would completely freeze. She couldn't connect her brain to the lower half of her body. They would have, you know, times where their muscles were so locked up that we're now actually looking at a potential for myotonia dystonia. So every time, as I said, the only specialist who has ever really been able to help in all of these cases has actually been the psychiatrist, because the psychiatrist is the only one who can do the medications. And we found a psychiatrist in Malaysia who was trained in London and also actually lectures at, I think, at Cambridge. And she accepted that there were big problems. The psychologist is saying the problems that he has aren't psychological problems, they're physical problems. And then the psychiatrist worked through this and we explained what was going on in terms of the things like the tachycardia and the stuff we were looking at for MS, etc. And she managed to get them on a drug regime that at least stabilised them. And she was one of the very few doctors who actually really listened, sat down, and we had long enough to be able to get to know her that she could go, look, I can see that there are all these problems. And she actually took over the whole, really the primary care, because they're on a combination of Prozac for depression. They're on, my son's on like 8 Ritalin a day, but he takes it as half a Ritalin, half a Ritalin, half a Ritalin, because if he takes 1.5, his muscles lock up. If he takes none, his muscles lock up. And we've found these things over years and years of literally trial and error. Any other medication other than Prozac will make them both instantly suicidal. They've tried different medications, and anything, particularly with norepinephrine involved in it, is disastrous for them. So we also know that it's within those particular pathways, but currently there is no known disease that gives the sorts of results to be able to identify through their symptomology. So it was really getting to the point where the most we could do is get them stable on a certain drug regime. After 20 years, we came back to Australia and suddenly they couldn't get those drugs anymore, because then we had to go, they wouldn't accept overseas tests. They wouldn't accept overseas diagnoses. The GP didn't have the authority to issue any of the drugs. Like, they're on high levels of diazepam to relax their muscles. They're on high levels of Ritalin. They're on relatively, my wife's on a high level of Prozac. And we then had to go through the process of getting everything reassessed in a public system that takes up to a year to get to see a specialist. So when we first got back, the first 2 years were hell. I mean, my son took over a year to get his Ritalin because a heart specialist decided that, he had high blood pressure and therefore he wasn't, he had a slightly different QT time, so he wasn't going to allow Ritalin. When he finally got on his Ritalin, his blood pressure dropped from 220 over 120 to 110 over 80. Again, it was things that we know that have worked, been through experience. You try to explain it to most specialists and you only get 10 minutes to talk to them. And it's only really now, after we've gone through multiple specialists and they're getting to know us, like the latest comment from the neurologist when he saw my wife was, I want to see these famous legs, because everyone knows about this edema that no one can understand, that they're actually starting to finally listen and starting to talk between themselves as to trying a bit more of a multidisciplinary approach. Now, the whole reason for me getting into the genetics side of it was that the genetics seems to be about the only real form of medicine left anymore that is multidisciplinary. It actually crosses over the specialties, and I've been using it purely to try and identify conditions through variants that exist with the two of them and not myself as a comparison, which are in most cases completely unreported. They're not in anyone's databases and they're only predictive scores. But what they've done is they've led me to illnesses that I had never even heard of, with symptoms that you go, and the way I think, as I said laterally, is, that fits that bit, that bit, that bit, that bit, that bit. And that starts to make sense. And then you'll find another gene, search back that through gene cards, through mellocards, and find out what it is actually, what it's related to, and go, okay, that other little symptom here starts fitting this component, and you start slowly building up an overall area, which our GP now is going, okay, it now makes sense that when I bring up a particular condition, she'll say, and we can try it, for example, with diets. There's a potential for actually the proteins and the long-chain fatty acids not actually breaking down properly and giving them the correct energy by slightly changing a few things. What she can do limited is actually to help us to try and at least improve their lives and get a bit more treatment. And then actually, once we can get some results from that, referring us to specialists and going further in that sort of testing.
Yeah. I mean, if we just take a step back, like, how did your kind of genetics journey begin? And And what are some of the things that you've been involved in? Because I know that someone connected you with the iHope program and things like that. And I've heard that you've been sifting through variants. Like, if you could just take us through that kind of journey, because it is an incredible one.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. A friend of mine that I met in Malaysia happened to be a bioinformatician. He's a Finnish professor, was a Finnish professor. He had helped co-write one of the first books on bioinformatics. He's also a biochemist as well. And we had been discussing about the possibility of actually setting up our own, basically setting up our own lab and focusing more on the privacy issues in terms of whole human genome sequencing, and to be able to give people a lifetime analysis, because he has the skills to be able to actually, do predictive bioinformatics and understands all the databases and everything about it. So what happened was, as I was talking to Illumina and looking at costing and the business side of it, I happened to mention that what was going on with my wife and son. So they said, well, look, okay, we'll talk to the iHope program and seeing whether they're prepared to put you within that program. And we're extremely lucky. I mean, there was only about, I think at that stage, about 10 families normally covered within that. But they also understood, and part of potential reason for why their conditions are so complex. I'm English, but my wife is Ukrainian Russian heritage. And I got interested in tracing their history through some of the things that my son did in America. And there was a potential coincidence, there's basically a potential link that has got a degree of evidence backing it up that they were actually related potentially to the royal families of Russia and ultimately back through to Europe, to England. And I'll come to the fact that the complexity and the number of variants, for example, for the two of them is way higher than mine. And we still don't know why, but they're all mainly heterozygous results. They're all multiple entries within the same variant. So it sort of got me interested in that. And then when the iHope program came up, we thought, oh, wonderful. At last we can actually hopefully get some sort of answers. And we were already starting to work with Professor Cook at Canberra Hospital and the John Curtin School of Medical Research. And I said, look, would it be okay? Because he was considering doing sequencing as well, knowing, because they were his patient. So he said, look, please go ahead. So after a couple of months, we managed to get that sorted out. Unfortunately, the results that came back were non-definitive. There was a stop-gain variant that my son and myself have, which is related to my mother, to do with cardiomyopathy, which did come up. And the only other things was drug resistance to the Prozac, which explains why my wife needs 3 Prozacs and my son only needs 1. So it was incredibly disappointing. I mean, we sort of expected and hoped that this thing would pick up. We've gone everything. We've gone through particularly porphyrias because they do have the same symptoms of porphyria, but they don't have the relapses between. And I even traced that one through the American and the UK Porphyria Association, etc. They've got so many things in common. And that was where we'd started to look for how to explain this, these sort of symptoms. And so luckily, iHope had agreed that they would provide me with the data. So they actually sent me the GVCX files and a number of the original files. So I thought, okay, talk to Marty, who was the bioinformatician friend, and said, okay, where do I start? And the main one was getting an editor so I could actually have a look at the files, which I eventually found GLOG, but worked really, really well, and nothing else did. On a really crappy old, Windows PC, and didn't even have Linux to be able to do good programming on it, and started actually physically looking at the files. And that was sort of where it started. And then talking to Marty, he taught me a lot about, you know, what to look for, what not to look for, a lot of the terminology. And I went through a lot of dead ends, and I went through a lot of bad starts. The very first time I tried it was I started to research what gene is related to a particular illness that I thought it might be, then grabbed the 3 files, literally went into Glog, searched for that particular gene, cut and pasted that into an editor, manually went through and sorted out all of the particular variants so that I had 3 different files. And I was finding in a lot of these cases that there were like 200 variants in Natalie's file and maybe 180 in Sam's and 60 in mine. So I thought, oh, wonderful, this is fantastic. And then I talked to a real bioinformatician, and they said, well, they're all like totally irrelevant and they're not important. So then I started going through and looking at every single RS number and referring that to SNP and ClinVar one by one, and looking at the how, you know, the frequency of it, and also how it was considered, whether it was pathogenic, etc. Went through that way and really came down with a group of genes which still didn't really define anything. So the next part of the journey was I did take some findings from that and sent it off to Professor Cook, and I also sent it off and was eventually got on to the head of the lab of the Garvan Institute in Sydney, because basically I was trying to talk to as many people within the industry as I could to say, look, what do I do with this stuff? I don't understand it. And to be honest, I still don't understand most of it. But and Amanda Russell at Garvan Institute then turned around and said, look, you're going about it the wrong way. What I'd suggest is you look for unknown variants. So a friend of mine who was a good Python programmer helped me isolate a lot of things. And we sort of cut the databases down a little so that we eventually ended up with about 3,500 variants for my wife and roughly the same for my son, which were all variants with no RS number, and you know, they're just basically a dot on the reference file. And then from there, I started. She also put me onto Varsome, and the good thing about Varsome was the one, you could trial it out for free, and also the fact that when I went and looked at an indel, which I'd been using Variant Ranker before, and Variant Ranker is absolutely terrible with indels. It has no predictive scores at all and has no information on them. It was starting to show some interesting results. So what I'd do is I'd go through each variant line by line, 3.5, close to 4,000 of each of them, find something that turned around and said it was uncertain, likely pathogenic, or had certain significance. Each line, I would look at what the gene was, go to gene cards, see what related issues, like what related diseases or anything they were, or what it was actually doing in terms of the proteins. Then reference that to mallet cards to see what sort of symptoms were, and then coming back and going, okay, that starts to look interesting, right? And then slowly whittled it down to a multiple list of uncertain, likely pathogenic, etc., into a very large spreadsheet, and then started sorting that spreadsheet. So what I ended up was a list for Sam and a list for Natalie, and I also did the same with pathogenic stop gained, and isolated each of the major areas within the actual GBCF file. And then went back to the original file, looked at that particular entry, brought them out to see, in fact, whether they were high quality reads or bad quality reads, and whether they applied what the actual like the genetic codes were, and compared, put the 3 of them together so that it could see, okay, Natalie had it, Sam didn't have it, I didn't have it, but that seems to be the way her symptomology goes, or Natalie and Sam have it, I don't have it. I then also cross-referenced to the exome sequencing that Professor Cook had done, and again, he'd found really nothing of any significance to do with the immunological side. And I've come down now to a list of about 5 or 6 variants that are unknown, predicted to be likely pathogenic or pathogenic, aren't in even CAD or DAN databases, either novel or generally extremely rare, but which have suddenly given me, okay, NAV1, for example, which is to do with paramyotonia, starts to explain why they both got exercise intolerance, why they've got problems, why their muscles aren't releasing. And the clinical indicators of what they have now start to make sense. I've then been able to discuss that with my doctor, and she's gone, okay, there are unknown variants for dystonia and for paramyotonia von Nuremberg, and so they're now being examined. We're now, hopefully, we'll actually be seeing the neurologist in January. They're things that can be tested for. So it's a difficult process. It's an incredibly time-consuming process. Varsheim have been absolutely wonderful, because what was happening was, you know, I started running out of time limits, and I was sort of getting, you know, throttled down to 2 or 3 a minute, and I was going through thousands at the time. So I requested and said, look, is there any chance of giving me access? And all I was doing was looking them up, seeing how they were, how many, you know, what sort of frequency, and eliminating as much as possible out of that particular list. And they gave me basically unlimited, or I think it's 60 a minute or something, so that I could constantly go through this whenever I had spare time, and basically, you know, start at the beginning, and 4,500 later, I went finished and went, wow. And I had a whole heap of mugs on me that I sent off to a number of people. Some of them said, not quite sure, maybe it's not conserved well enough. We don't think it's necessarily protein coding, but at the same time, they fit certain criteria within their whole symptomology, which is giving us enough ability now to hopefully be able to go and actually test. And you know, some of the things I found which turned up as definitely, you know, pathogenic, very high CAD scores and everything, they turn around and say, oh, well, you know, they're not rare enough. And then I look at the data and go, well, at the same time, you've got, you know, 14 positive pathogenics and 6 that are saying it's benign. And yes, some people who've got that particular variant aren't sick, but at least you can test for it. So I have challenged quite a few people, and I've upset quite a few people by being a bit pig-headed about the whole thing. But at the same time, what I learned from the text at Illumina and from Marty and from even the way Professor Cook teams work at it, the standard is to filter out anything that's slightly low quality, even though in our case, it might be that Sam has a low GX, we both got passes, right? It would be completely eliminated from the whole database. Anything that wasn't known, in most cases, was eliminated from the database. Anything below a certain threshold in terms of frequencies was completely eliminated from the database. And virtually none of it was ever referenced back to actually what either their clinical results or their symptoms. And that's why I've come into it from a different way. I've done it very naively, and, you know, I'm not an expert. I don't understand, like, I'm getting a result. I still don't know exactly, you know, how to properly read it within the, you know, within the gene readers or anything. All I'm going by is predictive scores helping to identify a potential illness that is one of at least, and even Professor Cook admits, would be at least between 3 and 5 separate overlapping illnesses, to at least then be able to give a way to be able to start clinically diagnosing these things. And a lot of them just make sense. You know, when you're going through and you suddenly come up with, you know, paramyotonia, and you go, well, they've got compression, but he doesn't lose muscle mass. It's one of the few things that does that. So our GP is going, it makes enough sense now to be able to actually go to a neurologist and say, look at that, ignore the rest. Ignore the fact that he's had a high white blood cell count his whole life. You know, it's like they look at the results, they look at everything going there, and they try to encompass that into one illness. And it's an impossible way of trying to diagnose. And on top of that, because each of them is so specialised and they can't legally or ethically talk about any other specialty, you try to talk to them about, well, how does this interact with so-and-so or whatever? They claim up. And they don't have that ability to be able to do things. I mean, we unfortunately were in a situation in Malaysia where we lost everything due to unforeseen circumstances and an extremely bad partner. You know, if I had a lot of money, my dream was to get a specialist from every area and hire them all for 2 days in a room and sit down and say, okay, this is what's wrong. Here are long-term results that no one can explain, but if maybe all of you put your heads together, maybe we can explain. Yep. And that's what I was hoping to do with the genetics. And so far, it seems to be showing results. And I know that it's a very different way, and it's probably a controversial way of doing it, and it's an extremely time-consuming way of doing it. Yeah. But it seems to be, you know, as I said, it seems to be getting results.
Yeah. I mean, if we could use this kind of interview as a call to action, what would you kind of say to people that like about the support that you may need or the expertise that you need? Like, what do you kind of need or hope going forward?
I'm really hoping that the talk can help focus, get more of a connect between the symptomology and the way that the data scientists basically think about what they're doing. Because if you're immediately, if you're not, how can I put it, you have to somehow relate what the person's suffering to actually what you're finding. And it doesn't appear to be, maybe it's not possible. I mean, the fact that, you know, one thing's done by a lab and it's done through specific filtering and everything. When it comes to very rare things, it needs to be much more multidisciplinary, and it needs to much more look at possibilities that can then be followed up clinically. But the biggest problem, for example, that I have is, you know, I've used KEGG, I've used a whole heap of other things. KEGG, I mean, for example, to look at pathways and to look at all the genes within a particular illness. The big problem I have at the moment, and that particularly my son suffers from, is that I can't find any gene anywhere in the pathway that shows any results relating to sustained high adrenaline in the blood, almost, in the case of norepinephrine, almost unmeasurable in urine, extremely low HVA, which is showing the dopamine channel's not working properly, but there is no explanation for that. And no one yet has been able to come up with it. So I'm hoping that, you know, a few of the things that they actually do suffer from, and which are clinical results, maybe someone within the community can go, oh, I've heard of that. Maybe, have you looked at that particular gene, or have you looked at another way of being able to go and diagnose it, or there's a specialist there who may understand that. Maybe getting, you know, references from people to say, similar to what Amanda did, you know, getting onto Garvan Institute, and she said, look, I can't really help you. We can't do analysis, but I can help point you in the right direction. You know, I don't mind doing the work. I mean, that's what I'm here for, to try and find it. But when you go through all of the pathways and you go through every gene and don't find anything significant or different, but you know that this is something that maybe only the two of them have. And maybe it's related to something to do with, you know, the fact that they've got obvious things wrong with their blood. You know, they've got high IR2 times. They've got a number of, I think, factor 10 and factor 11 high results. You know, maybe it's to do with low IGF. I mean, strange things are really with their symptoms. They had a lot of memory problems. My son's PTSD came back because I tried lysozyme chloride as an anti-inflammatory. It worked for a while as an anti-inflammatory, but what it did was it unlocked both of their memories. No one can explain it. Although the more I'm researching it, lysozyme seems to be very closely related to memory. But I cannot currently get the supply that I need out of Netherlands to try to see if it'll actually help with the inflammation again, because it's not on the TGA list in Australia. You know, it's like so many of these things are difficult because, you know, we're going through with our psychiatrist trying to maybe see if we can find a different, something different than Prozac. We know that a lot of the long-term drugs that they've been on, my son's been on morphine now for quite a long time. He was on codeine before that. It's the only thing that helps with pain. My wife is now close to allergic to codeine. We tried changing to methadone. Half a tablet narcotized her for 5 days. Our pain specialist is going, what? I give up to 100 milligrams a day and you're saying 2.5 milligrams will narcotize her? You know, more than 130 milligram codeine at the moment, she'll lose a memory. But nothing else works. You know, it's like, and no one can explain why, even, you know, with current diagnoses of, for example, FMS, why none of those drugs will help with the pain in the slightest. The only things that really help actually are Ritalin, diazepam, and opioids. And they're extremely difficult to get in Australia. They're so controlled that we've got to go to a specialist every single time we want to try and see if we can amend it. So it's, I don't know, I suppose I'm trying to find someone maybe who's a bit more diagnostic, a bit more cross specialist, who may be able to look at their case and I can show them clinical results over like 20 years and go, well, gee, maybe it's this, try something else. Yeah. You know, both of them, they're in a wheelchair. My son's bedbound 22 hours a day. On top of that, if he has PTSD attacks, his muscles are totally destroyed. You know, I spend anything up to 2 hours a day massaging both. I can't work. I haven't been able to for like 15 years. Both of them need a wheelchair to go out, and they need maybe 3 or 4 days to be able to build their energy to be able to get to a point where they can go out. When they come back again, they're totally exhausted and again for another week or two. And every time we talk to someone, and I would have seen at least 50 different doctors over 30 years, they go, well, there's something obviously wrong. We've got no idea what it is. Go away. And that's literally been the attitude. Go away. I don't have the time for this. I don't have the resources for this. And unfortunately, that's, you know, a neurologist doesn't talk to a metabolic specialist. And there is no metabolic specialist in Canberra on top of it, even if the ACAD9 gene turns out to be correct. So, you know, we're hoping that maybe even someone can look at the results I've got, maybe look at what my overall database is, and maybe run another analysis that's using a different methodology and go, good, maybe they can just look at what the symptoms and what the overall clinical results and say, well, oh, gee, I know something that may explain that. Or talk to someone, find network, basically.
Yeah, it's such a complex case, and I hope that someone watching this might be able to help you along your journey. But thank you so much for sharing your story today, Pia. It's been it's an incredible story, and your determination is unbelievable. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Hello everyone, if you enjoyed this video, then make sure you check out some of our other videos in our series by subscribing below or going to our website, frontlinegenomics.com. I hope you enjoy.